Well, shalom, dear friends, and welcome to our Genesis Bible study. For today, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 12. It's an exciting turning point in God's plan for his creation, particularly mankind. We're going to be entering into a new dispensation today involving a new covenant. One of the main characters of the Bible is Avram or Abram. God will, a few chapters later, change his name to Avraham, and we will talk about the significance of that name change when we get to that. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at our PowerPoint introduction for Genesis chapter 12. Here is a Bible chart for what Alfred Eade, the artist and originator of this book of charts, he calls it the fourth dispensation, the patriarchal one. And the patriarchs are these guys that are indicated in the circles on this chart. It would be Abraham, his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, who also experiences a name change to the name of Israel. And we'll talk about the significance of that name change when it comes. The red ribbon of salvation or redemption runs through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So these are the patriarchs of the redemption family, the salvation family. Jacob is going to have 12 sons whose names are listed here, but one of those sons, Judah, will be one that the red ribbon goes through. And some of these other sons are very consequential in the Bible. Reuben is the oldest, so you would think that according to natural convention and natural law, that the red ribbon would run through Reuben, but there are some reasons why it doesn't. Shimon, Simeon, is the next oldest. Then comes Levi, or Levi in English. He's going to play a particularly important role in the cosmic plan of God for his creation and for mankind, in that he will be chosen, or his descendants, his family will be chosen to be the priestly family. One of his descendants will be a man named Aaron, who will be the brother of Moses, and Aaron will be like the first high priest. And this was a, what would you call it? Like a family blessing that God placed upon them. So the high priest would always be a descendant, a relative of Aaron. Aaron was only one of the descendants of Levi, but the rest of the family of Levi will not be priests, in the fact that meaning that they will not offer the animal sacrifices in the tabernacle and later the temple. But the rest of the Levites will be kind of the workers, the assistants, the Levites, they're called, in that grand sacrificial system that, remember, is figurative of, symbolic of the high priestly work of the Son of God, Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ. The family of Judah, through which the red ribbon does go, is the royal family, the kingly family. So the kings of Israel are going to come out of that family. And then the rest of the descendants here play lesser roles until we come to Joseph. And Joseph will play a very prominent role in the last chapters of Genesis. I think starting about chapter 30. I should have looked that up beforehand. I want to say 35 or something like that. Towards the there are 50 chapters in Genesis, so Joseph is going to play a prominent role in a lot of those chapters towards the end. He is so prominent that you might think that the red ribbon of salvation would run through him, but it doesn't. It is Judah And the reason it runs through Judah is that the Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, is from this family. He's born into this family. Yeah, that's a little bit of the background. One of the significances of this fourth dispensation, it's called the Age of Promise, is where the promises of God become very significant in the lives of God's chosen people. Up until this point in history, God has been working with all humanity. They are divided into people groups, nations, cultures, etc. But at this point in the plan of God, a particular family is chosen. And that family is the family of Avram, Yitzhak, and Israel, or Yaakov. So they are the patriarchs. God makes promises to them. In fact, the most prominent feature of this dispensation, or this time or period or era of stewardship, is the promises that God makes. One of the things that we will encounter in the story of Abraham is that the Bible says explicitly that Abraham believed God, meaning the promises of God, and his faith was credited to him as righteousness. So righteousness for the chosen family of God does not come about by works of the law or moral excellence or anything like that. It comes through faith. And that is going to be an important characteristic of God's plan all through the Old Testament and through the New Testament as well. In fact, when we get to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul is going to make very strong arguments that salvation is not by works of the law, but by God's grace through faith. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. There are so many verses that talk about this. In fact, even John 3:16 tells us that the way of salvation is through faith. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever, believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. So faith or believing is the avenue to salvation, being in fellowship with God and receiving the gift of new birth and eternal life. So that's the chart that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at this chart for quite some time in quite a few chapters that we will be studying. Today is going to be the beginning of the story of God's relationship with Abraham. And we want to look at a map of the travels of Abraham after God calls him to be that special chosen person that would kind of be the patriarch, I guess, of the chosen people, which would eventually become the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. So here's a map. Want to point out a couple of important places on the map. One is Ur, this city. It's spelled U-R. It's down here by the mouth of the the delta of the Persian Gulf here. Here is the Euphrates River. It empties into the Gulf here. Actually, the origin of the Euphrates River is up in this mountain range here. And I think the same location is the source of the Euphrates River that I'm tracing here. And it's also the source of the Tigris River that I'm tracing here. So it may not be the identical source, but it's the source of these two very prominent rivers comes from this area, this mountain range. I forget what those mountains are called. I don't know if it's the Taurus Mountains. I think Taurus is just these this mountain range to the west. I forget what these mountains are called, but anyway, that's the source of these two rivers. The territory in between the Euphrates River and the Tigris River is called Mesopotamia, which is, what is that? Greek for the territory. Meso means middle of, and Potamia means the rivers, the area between the rivers. Now, this is all desert region. This whole big area that I'm circling with my pointer is desert. But because of these two rivers running through that territory, Mesopotamia, or the region between those two rivers, is very fertile, very fruitful. It was it's called the cradle of civilization, where great civilizations started and so forth. I will point out that Babylon, or Bavel, which is the city where the Tower of Babel story took place. I also want to point out where Haran is, Haran, is a city here. And of course, the red arrow points the probable route of Abraham and his family as they left Ur of the Chaldeans and traveled to Haran. The dotted line arrow is a possible route, an alternative route, but I think probably less likely. That brought the family to Haran, and they stayed there until the death of Terah, who was Avram's father. And then they come south into the land that God promises them. And Carchemish is a famous spot in history. We came down this direction, and here we have the geographical area where the modern state of Israel is. Tyre and a kind of a sister city, Sidon, are here and are actually in Lebanon. Israel starts from kind of here and runs down here, and then the modern state goes down to the Gulf of Aqaba. To Eilat is the name of a resort city there. And then here's the Jordan River that runs north and south in Israel. Here is the Sea of Galilee, or Yom Kinneret in Hebrew. And down here is Yam HaMelach, or the Salt Sea, better known today as the Dead Sea. And then, of course, these two fingers are the Gulfs of Aqaba and the Gulf of Suez, which is a part of the larger sea, the Red Sea. And we'll talk more about the Red Sea when we get to the story of the Exodus. I've got a Bible verse in here that I want to bring to your attention. Part of the promise that God makes to Avram when he calls him to be his special guy is that he will have, God will give him seed. And when the Bible uses zerah in Hebrew, that's a reference to descendants or offspring. The promise also involves land. Let's see, Abraham and his family would be kind of wandering shepherds, kind of going from place to place, trying to find pasture land. But God is going to give them real estate. And then the third thing is that God is going to bless this family in extraordinary ways. He's going to make a covenant with this family, and he has blessed them in extraordinary ways. And we'll talk about all three of those aspects when we get into our text for today. But while we're looking at a map, I want to emphasize the extent of the land, the territory that God is going to give Abraham and his descendants. So for that territory, we want to look to Genesis 13, which we're going to be in chapter 12 today. So this is from the next chapter. So we will review this when we get to it next time. The Lord said to Avram, after Lot, his nephew, had separated from him, God said to Avram, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are. And at that time, he was kind of standing right in the middle of what we would call modern day Israel. He said, look northward, southward, eastward, and westward. So look in all four compass directions. Verse 15, for all the land which you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever. Now, this ability to see the promised land was not limited to just the position from which Abraham would turn in a circle and view. It wasn't just line of sight from there. But this is a promise that since the time that God called Abraham, all the land that he saw would be given to him and to his descendants forever. God went on to say, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So if you would think of it like the grains of sand on the earth, that's the magnitude of the descendants of Abraham that would eventually come about. So that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. And remember, this took place like about 4,000 years ago. So God has continued to keep this promise. So there have been lots and lots of descendants, maybe exactly the same number as the the grains of sand on the earth, but whatever, it's going to be a big family. And then in verse 17, God says, arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. So if we start with the call of Abraham here in Ur of the Chaldeans, and are brought to understand that God is going to give him all the land that he sees and all the territory where his feet walk, it's going to be a lot of ground. Starting here in Ur of the Chaldeans, it goes up here into through what would be like modern day Iraq, into Syria, down into Lebanon, down into Israel, and he's even going to have an expedition into Egypt. So what this verse is saying is that that all the territory that Abram sees or where his feet walk is going to be given to him. So I'm just going to draw a circle around the promised land. Just in general terms, it's this territory right here. It's most of the Middle East, and God is going to give it to Abram and to his descendants for how long? Look where my pointer is. Forever. There is a lot of dispute nowadays over, who has a right to possess and live in the promised land that I call Israel. Some people call it Palestine, which is just illustrative of the debate and the argument. But according to God, this land, all of this land, has been given to Abram and his descendants forever. Now, the debate nowadays involves just this small territory of the modern state of Israel, but that is not nearly all of the territory that God gave him. It extends from Iraq to Egypt. In another place, the western border will be called the River of Egypt, which is the Nile. So the promise of land is a huge territory covering most of the Middle East. Now, one thing I think is kind of interesting, if I can project into the future a little bit and go to the book of Revelation, in chapters 21 and 22, the last two chapters of Revelation, the dimensions of the holy city of New Jerusalem, the place where I think God presently lives and where he will live on earth, is going to come down to earth, and that is going to be God's headquarters. It's going to be his holy city. and people from the nations around it will, come and worship God and have dealings with God and his chosen people, the faithful. That city is said to be 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles. And of course, the dimensions are given in Greek language. I think it's stadia there, but it equates to 1,500 miles. So if we would assume that the city of New Jerusalem is going to come into a landing right in the middle of our map here, 1,500 miles would be just about the distance from the River of Egypt to the great river Euphrates on the east. And 1,500 miles this way is about the size of the promised land. So I think those two ideas are kind of harmonious. One other thing I want to make mention of is that most scholars believe that Ur of the Chaldeans is here near the delta of the Persian Gulf. And the significance of that is that that's where Abraham starts seeing and walking and receiving a promise of territory. I have a book in my library called The Exodus Case by Lennart Moller, Moller, with an umlaut over the O. And Moller suggests that perhaps Ur of the Chaldeans was not way down here near the Persian Gulf, but it was up north of Haran. And the argument he gives for that is that there's a modern city up there called Urfa, U-R-F-A. And he even gives the ancient Aramaic name. It's Ur-Hai, U-R-H-A-I. And he may have some other evidence for this, but the argument that he gives in his book called The Exodus Case on page 25 is that this modern city of Urfa sounds like Ur. It's got, two of the four letters are similar to Ur. So I'm going to put a lot of stock in that, but I wanted you to know that there are some scholars, some archaeologists that believe this place up in, I suppose this would be Syria, that this is, or this might be Armenia, wherever it is, north of Haran, that could be where Abraham started seeing and walking. So if Ur of the Chaldeans was up here, then it would make the Holy Land, the Promised Land, much smaller. I'm not going to put a lot of stock in that, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. So there's a map of Abraham's migration. In the story for today, it kind of takes the western part of that map. And of course, this map shows some of the cities and locations where Abraham settled. So we will be talking about those places where he settled in Genesis 12 through 14. And then I guess again in chapters 18 through 22. But today we are going to have a story about Abraham and Sarah, before they had any kids at all, leaving from this promised land and going down into Egypt for a while and having some dealings with Pharaoh. So the reason the red arrows of their coming and going end up here around On in Egypt is it is believed that that's where the Pharaoh was located. So here again, Abraham and Sarah see and walk all the way to the River of Egypt, the western boundary of the Promised Land. A couple of Bible verses about what would it be? The chronology of the original calling of Abraham. There are a couple of contextual passages that we want to look at so we can have kind of a clear understanding of how this call took place and the various travels of Abraham and his family. In Joshua 24, this is the last chapter of Joshua, I believe. It's after the conquest of the Promised Land had taken place. And at that time, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called the elders of Israel for their heads, or for their judges, and for their officers. And they presented themselves before God. Now, this is kind of the forming of an early Israeli government, which kind of harkens back to the age of human government, the dispensation and period of time where human government was an essential part of God's plan for man. And so Joshua, in keeping with that principle of human government, is forming a government there from the elders of Israel and the various functions that they would carry out. Verse 2, and Joshua said to the people, thus says the Lord Adonai, this is the sacred name of God, Yahweh, Adonai Elohim, the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor. Nahor is the brother who lived the longest. There was another brother named Haran, not Haran, but Haran, with like a soft hey or H sound, who died even before his father did. So Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river. That would be the Euphrates River in old times. And they served other gods. So here the Bible is saying that the family of Abraham, when they lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, were idol worshippers. They were idolaters, just like everybody else who lived in that territory. Maybe followers of the gods of Nimrod, kind of the satanic worship. So Abraham's family was a part of that. Now, one of the things we may see in the study notes from the Dake Bible is that Dake says that when God called Abraham, Abraham became a believer in God at that point and became obedient to him. And that Dake thinks Abraham may have been influential in bringing his father Terah to repentance and faith in the one true God of the Bible. But what is very clear is that idolatry was in the history of this family. Joshua goes on to say, then I took, he's quoting God. So God says, then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river and led him throughout all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. That's the seed, the promised seed, Isaac. Now, it does say that they were on the other side of the river. So I want to go back to our map here and say Ur, shown on this map, to be on the west side of the river Euphrates. And Joshua is speaking also from the west side of the Euphrates River. Here's the Euphrates River, and he's on the west side of it. But I think like the way we need to look at this is that, like, if you are here, the Jordan River is to the right of you, it's to the east of you. And so if you trace the Jordan River up until its source here in Damascus and continue this direction, and like keep the Euphrates River, like if you would just retrace the path of Abraham here, the Jordan River is on your right, and you travel up here to the north and continue to keep the Euphrates River on your right. When you get down here to where Ur is, then Ur is across the river, across the river. So it's like on the other side of the river, on the other side of the path that Abraham walked. So Stephen also in Acts chapter 7, and really this chapter of Acts is basically Stephen's statement, his testimony before he was executed for being a heretic, I guess you would say. And in his witness that he gives, in his testimony that he gives, he starts out with the story of the call of Abraham. So then the high priest said, "Are these things?" Said to Stephen, "Are these things so?" And Stephen, said, "Brothers and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." Now, Stephen is telling us that Ur of the Chaldeans, which is where Abraham lived before he lived in Haran, is in Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, like not up in Syria. Although I guess you could probably say that, the upper Syrian location might be considered between the two rivers. But this was before he dwelt in Haran. And said to him, "Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to the land I will show you." Now, in our text for today, it's going to appear that Abraham did not receive his call until he was in Haran. And after he received the call, then he left. But that's not the case. According to Stephen, whose words here are inspired by the Holy Spirit, that God appeared to him when he was still in Mesopotamia and said these words in Mesopotamia: "Get out of your country and for your relatives and come to the land that I will show you." Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, when Terah died, he moved him to this, God moved him to this land in which you now dwell. Stephen is saying, you descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dwelling in the promised land. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even to set his foot on. So all the time that Abraham was living in the promised land, he didn't own any of it, but he had a promise for it. And that was good enough for him. He believed that promise. And so God, fulfilled that promise, not for Abraham in particular, but for his descendants. Not even enough to set his foot on. When Sarah died, Abraham had to buy a piece of real estate to have a place to bury his wife. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. God did that, promised to give him seed. So seed and land, two parts of the Abrahamic covenant. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. There's a little debate among scholars about which foreign lands is God talking about. I believe the textual evidence is that the foreign land is not just Egypt, but also Egypt and Canaan, which was a foreign land to him. He didn't possess it yet. And that the 400 years would be basically the period from the time that Abraham was called by God to the time the law was given. So he promised him the land for his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, that they would bring him into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage, Egypt, that part of it is restricted to Egypt, because they were the ones that brought Abraham and his family into bondage, into slavery. They were not slaves in Canaan. Although they weren't landowners, they had lots of wealth and possessions. They were very powerful and influential in Canaan. I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. So that brings us to the end of our preliminary stuff. I think you will see as we go through this text that it was worth the 34 minutes that we spent on that. So now let's go ahead and jump into the text of Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord had said to Avram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. That's not the end of the promise that's made here, age of promise. God is promising Abraham some stuff, or Avram some stuff here. Our English text says, had said. Now, that is technically correct. In our Hebrew, it is this verb right here, va yomer, va yomer. The va part of this that's highlighted in yellow there is the conjunction and. It's not unusual to start a sentence in Hebrew with the word and, which you would think as a conjunction is just a continuation of a prior thing or a thought. But it's really not. I mean, there's a period here at the end of chapter 11, verse 32. This is a new sentence, but it begins with the word and. In Hebrew, there is something called a vav consecutive. There's a vav conjunctive, which would just be the conjunction and, but there's a vav consecutive, which means that in Hebrew, you wouldn't really think of this as the word and, but you would think of it as a consecutive, meaning that it's going to change the aspect of the main word, yomer, which is the Hebrew word for said. Now, this form of the Hebrew word yomer is in what is called the imperfect, which is usually a present ongoing tense. If it just said amar, then it would be a perfect form of that verb, and it would mean it was a completed action. If it just said amar, then you would say that God said to him in the past, like all he intended to say to him. But here it's Omar, which makes it seem like a present tense or even a future tense verb. Well, future tense doesn't work in this case because the context of the sentence insists on a past tense verb, a completed action verb. But this is an imperfect or a continuing action verb. But here's the thing. The vav consecutive changes the aspect of an imperfect verb to a perfect verb. Now, I know that sounds very confusing, but it is very, very, very common in Hebrew. And what it comes down to is if you're learning Hebrew, you are just aware that there are so many vav consecutives that change the aspect or the tense of a Hebrew verb that you don't even pay attention to the tense that it's in. You use the context to tell you. So the best the Hebrew grammar tells us about this is that this speaking that God did happened in the past. And that's why it doesn't say, now the Lord said to Avram, but he had said to him, which would be a completed action in the past. So there is no word had in the Hebrew. There is only this form of the verb amar, but because of the grammar and the vav consecutive, this English is correct. So the had is added to make the English grammar line up with the requirements of Hebrew grammar. I apologize for that, but I just want to emphasize why this idea of had said is correct. The Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, out of your family, from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. And in all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him. Where did he depart from? Haran. But Stephen has told us that that God appeared to him in Ur of the Chaldeans before he lived in Haran. And Stephen says that's where he spoke these words of the Abrahamic covenant. So let's put that in order here. Now the Lord had said to Avram sometime in the past. When did he say these words of the covenant? When he was still in Haran. So our English is correct, even with Genesis 12, even though Genesis 12, if taken all by itself, makes it look like God first spoke the Abrahamic covenant to Abraham when he was living in Haran. Stephen makes it clear that it took place before then in Ur of the Chaldeans, and Stephen is correct according to the Hebrew grammar. Okay, sorry about that, but I just wanted to get the chronology right and be in harmony with the biblical text. So here's the content of the Abrahamic covenant. First, there's a requirement. There's like a command. Get out of your country. The Hebrew word for this is, it's actually a compound word, me'aretzcha. The root word is aretz, which is just, as we said before when we've come across this term earlier, it can be a reference to the planet Earth, or it can be a reference to just the dry land part of the earth, or it can be a reference to the Holy Land, the Promised Land. One of my Hebrew teachers just revealed to me, after years of studying Hebrew, he revealed to me that if the Hebrew text is talking about the Promised Land, the vowels underneath the consonants in Eretz are two segals or E sounds, and it would be pronounced Eretz. So when Jews talk about the Promised Land, they talk about Eretz Israel with the E vowels. Aretz is everything outside the Promised Land. The vowels here are patach and a shva. So the patach is kind of an A sound. So this would be pronounced Aretz, not Eretz, because this command came when Abram was living outside the the Promised Land, except for the fact that Ur is part of the Promised Land. It just hasn't yet been possessed. So I guess what I wanted to say about the Promised Land, if there's dispute today over the modern state of Israel, like who belongs to that, the real question should be who owns the entire Middle East. So anyway, with that in mind, get out of your country and from your family. U mi moled techa. Molad is a root word it's related to the idea of having been given birth. So this would be your birthplace, and we know the birthplace was what? Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram lived there with his family when they were idol worshipers. Remember, this was spoken back in Ur of the Chaldeans. And basically God is saying, get out of not only your country, but your birthplace and from your father's house, from the house of your father. Now, this is kind of interesting because God speaks this part of the command to Abram when he's living in Ur of the Chaldeans. He's supposed to leave Ur, but he's also supposed to leave his father's house. But he doesn't immediately. The whole family moves from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran, and they stay there for a while until Terah dies, and then they move south into the Promised Land. So some people say that Abraham was disobedient to his father. I'm going to say not necessarily. It makes it sound like he should have left Terah and Nahor and probably Lot behind in Ur of the Chaldeans, gone to Haran himself, and then further. But I don't think that's what it's saying. One of the things that the Bible has told us about Avram is that he was married to Sarai. And when you marry a wife, what do you do according to Genesis? For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. So you could say that Avram, because he married Sarai, which was her name before it was changed, had left their father's house when they got married. But in order to fulfill their responsibility to mother and father, honor your father and your mother that you may live long in the land that the Lord God is giving you. That's one of the 10 commandments. Abraham may have felt an obligation to take care of his elderly father as long as he was alive. But once he died, then Abram had fulfilled that responsibility. So he continued his travels south. So I guess, if you wanted to be nitpicky, you could say that Abraham disobeyed God by taking his family with him. But back in chapter 11, it said that it was Terah who took his family from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran. And that may be one reason that we should believe that Abraham's calling was so influential, that Terah also repented of idolatry and took his family out of an idolatrous territory to probably another idolatrous territory in Haran, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great, and remember that possession of the land involves seeing that land. God says, I will show you that land, and walking on it. I will make you a great nation. And this involves offspring. And at this point that Abraham is receiving his calling, he's an elderly man. Sarah is 10 years younger than he is, but they don't have any kids. And I assume they've been trying to have kids for a long time. So I will make you a great nation. God is saying, Sarah's barrenness is not an issue for me. I can still give you offspring, even though she is beyond, when she gives birth, she'll be beyond the age of normal childbearing. So this is going to be a miraculous birth. I will bless you and make your name, I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be a blessing. So God says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. So God is going to bless Abraham, and by extension, all of his offspring. And I'll make your name great. You're going to be famous, influential, powerful, and you shall be a blessing. Now, one of the things we're going to notice is all the time that Abraham is living in the promised land, all the people around him who become friends with him also receive a blessing just because of their cordial relationship with Abraham. So God says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. So if the people that are neighbors to Abraham and his family are friendly with them, are cordial with them, then God blesses those people. But if they're hostile towards Abraham, or if they try to do him wrong, then they experience curses. And throughout biblical history, we're going to see that that's true. Those nations, those people groups that bless Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people, Israel, receive a blessing in return. Those nations or people groups that are dishonest with them, don't like them, try to do them violence and harm, those nations come under a curse. It is interesting, since 1948, when the modern state of Israel was founded, it's interesting to trace the relationship of our country, the United States of America, with Israel. Some American presidents have been very friendly towards Israel. For example, in 1948, Harry Truman was the president of the United States. He was a Democrat, and but was very friendly towards Israel. And President Truman brought about a vote in the United Nations in 1947 that supported Israel becoming a modern state, becoming a nation, rather than just a Jewish group of settlers. It became a nation. And Harry Truman, so the U.S. was friendly. Other American presidents, and I won't mention them by name, but you probably know who they are more hostile towards Israel and more supportive of the modern day Palestinians that live there. And when they do deals, when these hostile American presidents do bad deals with Israel, things that threaten the security of Israel, then America suffers. They suffer economically, they suffer natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes and things like that. So just watch the relationship between America and Israel through the years. If it's favorable, America is blessed. Donald Trump was very favorable towards Israel, brought about the moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, where it should have been all along, was influential in the Abraham Accords that, tried to work for peace and kind of normative relations between Middle Eastern countries. And the U.S. was economically blessed, blessed in military operations. The present president is not so friendly to them. And look at the economy of America, look at the security issues, look at the like energy conditions, look at at border security and things like that. So America is suffering. Look at the hurricanes and stuff like that in recent years. So God is still keeping this part of the Abrahamic promise 4,000 years later. This covenant is forever, and God will continue to honor it forever. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, I think this blessing to all the families of the earth is a direct reference to the fact that the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, came out of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the Savior not only of Israel, but of the whole world. So through faith in him, all of the families of the earth, all the nations of the earth, all the cultures and people groups of the earth, through faith in Yeshua, can join Israel in the blessings of this Abrahamic covenant. It's Galatians 3, verse 7. I can't quote it verbatim, but basically the Apostle Paul says, all believers from all different nations and cultures and regions and everything, races, everybody who believes in Jesus, in Yeshua, are children of Abraham and fall under the blessings and the requirements of the Abrahamic covenant. So if you are a Gentile Christian, through your faith in God's Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, you are part of this covenant family of Abraham. As Paul might say in Romans chapter 11, you've been removed from the olive tree of the Gentiles and grafted into the olive tree of Israel through your faith in Yeshua. So that's the covenant. It's only the first statement of the covenant, and it's very brief. It just mentions kind of the three major parts: offspring or seed, land, and a blessing to be given and receive. This Abrahamic covenant will be renewed periodically throughout the book of Genesis. Again in chapter 13, again in chapter 15, again in chapter 17, again in chapter 22, and maybe some more places as well. So it will be renewed to Abraham and to each of his offspring, Isaac and Jacob. Verse 4. So Avram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Avram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. But remember, he had received his call earlier in Ur of the Chaldeans. So how old was he when he first received the call in Ur? I don't know. You might be able to calculate that from the biblical chronology. But one thing I do know is that he's 75 years old when he leaves Haran and goes to the promised land. Spoiler alert here, he and Sarah are going to have to wait another 25 years for God to fulfill the promise of offspring. And that's going to be an issue for them. And we'll talk about the actions that Abraham and Sarah took to try to work that out, to kind of help God fulfill his promise and so forth. And the fallout of that, the consequences of that. But keep in mind that he's 75 years old. That would make Sarah 65 years old when they left from Haran. And I keep calling them Abraham and Sarah just out of habit, but I do know that their names haven't been changed yet. Avram in Hebrew means exalted father. Av, the first part of that word, is the Hebrew word for father. And Ram means like elevated or, high and lofty. Exalted is a good definition of that. And Sarai, I think that means princess. Sarai, our information window at the bottom of the page doesn't tell us, but her name is going to be changed to Sarah. We'll talk more about that when we get to it. So Avram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot. It's actually pronounced Lot in Hebrew. His brother's son. Lot was the son of Haran, his brother who died before their father died. So it appears to me that Abraham became kind of the, what would you call it, the guardian of his brother's son. And they took all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. So they're leaving with a large company of people here, all the the household goods and stuff like that they acquired, and the people who were in their family. We're going to find that they have a servant in their household named Eleazar, going to play a prominent role in future stories. At one point, Lot is kidnapped by some foreign kings, and Abraham has enough men in his household that he puts together an army of, I think it's 317 or 318 soldiers to go rescue Lot, and he does so successfully. So his household is very large. It's an agricultural family. They are shepherds as opposed to farmers. They're living in the desert, and being shepherds is a prosperous occupation to be in. So they departed Haran. They departed to go to the land of Canaan. Canaan, remember, is the name of the grandson of Ham. No, it's the is it the son or grandson of Ham? Anyway, descendant. It's also going to be the name of the people group that lived in Israel at the time Abraham lived there, and at the time that Joshua goes in after the Exodus to conquer those people. So yeah, this is a branch of the family of Ham, which is not a Semitic people. It's an African people. So they are living in the land at the time Avram goes there. Descendants of Ham are. So Abraham, a Shemite or a Semite, is going to be mixing with the Hamites. So it's the same family, but they don't necessarily always get along that well together. Same with the Egyptians. They are Hamites. So they came to the land of Canaan. So that territory, the name of the land they're living in, is named after Ham's descendant. Verse 6, Avram passed through the land to the place of Shechem in Hebrew. It actually means like to kind of rise up early in the morning, Shechem. I think it's also the name for a shoulder. I think it's the Hebrew word for a shoulder. So we went to Shechem if we wanted to look at the map, we could see where it is. It's right about in the middle of the modern state of Israel. As far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. So in Hebrew, I think I need to pull verse 6 up here. So the terebinth, the tree of Moreh. The Hebrew for this is elon. Elon is the Hebrew word for an oak tree. I don't even know what a terebinth tree is, but it's terebinth tree. Somebody may know that it's a different kind of a tree than an oak, but I think it's an oak type tree. So apparently prominent in that location because that tree is part of the name of that place, the terebinth tree of Moreh. So Elon, the terebinth tree of Moreh. Moreh. The lexicons are divided about the meaning of this word Moreh. Some say it's a reference to the Hebrew word for fear, which would be Yod, Yod Resh Aleph, or Y-R-A, Y-R-A. But that's not the root word as it appears here. So some people want to make the name of this place the Oak of Fear. Now, in support of that, I guess I could say that when you are traveling in a land where you've never lived before and have never even traveled to before, that can be a fearful thing. In fact, in Hebrew, when you do that, when you travel in a foreign land, you're called a ger, a G-R. And that does mean to travel in fear. But I think the word yireh, Yod, Resh, Aleph, is wrong because we have a hey here on the end of that word. So Moreh, which the root is Yod, Resh, Hey, or YRH, means teacher. A Moreh is a teacher. So Abraham settles at the oak tree of Moreh, or the oak tree of teaching. So who's teaching who? I think that Abraham may have settled here, or Abraham may have settled here because God was teaching him some important stuff, teaching him about himself, teaching him about the land he lives in, teaching him about the promises that he had been given, and things like that. So the terebinth tree of Moreh is the tree of teaching. And it tells us the Canaanites were in the land. Makes sense. It's the land of Canaan, so Canaanites are living there. Dake makes a deal out of this, saying that there were giants let me go back to 6 here. Dake makes a deal that the Canaanites is a reference to giants. Now, remember when we studied Noah's Ark, at the early part of chapter 6, it was talking about the sons of God, which I believe were fallen angels, intermarrying with the daughters of men. Those were human women, and having intercourse with them and producing a race of giants called the Nephilim, or in Greek, gigantes, from which we get giants. Dake is asserting here that some of these Canaanite tribes were giants, a part of that mixed race of people produced by the fallen angels and human women. And we will see in the future that there were giants in the land, even up until the days of David. But to insist that the term Canaanites is always a reference to giants is incorrect. Okay, Genesis 12, verse 7. Then Adonai, or Yahweh, appeared to Avram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar. He, being Avram, built an altar to Adonai, who had appeared to him. So here again, God has already spoken this call with a promise of seed or offspring, land, and a blessing. And God is repeating it here. He may have repeated it again in Haran. He definitely repeated it here in chapter 12 after Abraham arrived in the promised land. So maybe this is part of the teaching that God was doing there at the Oaks of Moreh, or the Oak of Teaching, just renewing the covenant with him, reminding him of the promises that he had made to him. And it also tells us that Abraham, the he here is a reference to Avram, he built an altar to Adonai, who appeared to him. So this is telling us that Adonai appeared to him, maybe in a physical manifestation that Abraham could see. In fact, I would insist on that. A lot of the communication that God does with these early patriarchs of the Bible is through the still small voice of conscience. But this is an appearance. This is a yera, an appearance, a manifestation. We call that a theophany. And if we're convinced that this person of the Trinity that appeared was the second person of the Trinity, the Messiah, then we would call it a Christophany. So I would say it could be either one. The Greek is kind of the same. Ophe means to view or to see. So this is a physical manifestation of God. And this manifestation speaks to him, and then goes on to say in verse 8, and he moved from there, Avram moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Now, Bethel too. Bethel and Ai are kind of in the middle of the country too, near Shechem. We could look at a map. I don't want to bother to do that right now. But so after Shechem, they settle in the mountains east of Bethel. And Abraham pitched his tent, set up housekeeping, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. When it says east of Bethel here, it's that Hebrew word mikedem. Kedem means east, but the mem prefix means from east, which seems to be like a westward direction. But here, it's very specific that says Bethel was on the west. And if you look in the Hebrew window, the yellow highlighted part is the Hebrew word yam, which is a reference to the Mediterranean Sea, which is definitely on the west. So Bethel was on the west of where Avram pitched his tent, and Ai was on the east. And here again, east is Mikedem. So even though, like literally, this term means from the east, it actually means to the east, just in practical application. And it's very clear in this text what it means. I go into a big deal on this when we're talking about the Garden of Eden, because the garden was east in Eden. So does that mean it's the eastern part or the western part? Kind of hard to tell. So there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Now, before we leave Bethel and Ai, we'll jump ahead a little bit to the book of Joshua, and in the conquest. Of course, Jericho was the first city that they conquered, and God miraculously conquered it. I guess in modern terms, we would say that Jericho fell without a shot being fired. They just blew trumpets at it, and it fell down. That is all God's doing. But they went on from there. The next battle they fought was Ai. Jericho was a big city. Ai was just a little village, just very small. And before they went into battle, Jericho or Joshua and the leaders decided they really didn't need many troops to go up there. They would just go up and kind of take it without a second thought. But the people in Ai beat them. defeated them in battle and sent them running. And it turned out that the reason they had lost that battle was just like one guy, a guy named Achan, disobeyed God and took some of the spoil for himself. And God punished the whole nation because of what that one guy did. So there's a great civic responsibility as part of this, principle of human government in the Bible. One guy can wreck it for the whole nation. After that guy was recognized as having committed this sin, he and his family were put to death, and then Ai was defeated easily. In the Hebrew, the city Ai, the highlighted part in the yellow is just pronounced I. It's an ayin and a yod. But there's a hey in front of it here, which may be a definite article. And our information window says that it is the particle the. So the I. Sometimes people want to know what I means. One possible explanation is I is the Hebrew word, or maybe it would be the Canaanite word for prostitute. So this town was called the prostitute. Or maybe I means something else. I also want to talk a little bit about the altar that Abraham built there. Why would he build an altar there? Well, worship of God in the Old Testament involves animal sacrifice. And we have seen in the story of Cain and Abel that God did not accept vegetable or grain sacrifices as being a sufficient form of worship for God. Now, even in the temple, grain offerings were a part of those sacrifices, but they always had to accompany a blood sacrifice, an animal sacrifice. And that is to remind, Adam and Eve were clothed with animal skins. Abel's offering of a blood sacrifice of animals was acceptable. Now, Abraham is going to remind us that when we worship God, we must offer a blood sacrifice. Well, you might say, well, Christians don't offer blood sacrifices anymore. That's because our blood sacrifice that all the animal sacrifices pointed to, Yeshua HaMashiach, the Lord Jesus, our Savior, offered himself as the ultimate blood sacrifice. Once that sacrifice is made and we believe in it, we receive all the blessings, and we're no longer required to offer animal sacrifices because we're not living under the old covenant. We're not living in the days of the Old Testament. We have the sacrifice that fulfilled the symbolism and the figurative nature, the typology of the animal sacrifices, so we don't need to offer animal sacrifices anymore. So you may think that worship of the God of the Bible is done with sacrifices. It's not true. If you read the prophecies of the millennium, there will still be animal sacrifices offered. Is that because they need to be offered to provide an atonement for people? No, these will be memorial sacrifices, a way that people can worship God in a way that reminds them that a blood sacrifice of Yeshua HaMashiach has been made for them. So this was an altar on which Abraham offered blood sacrifices. It was convenient for him to do that because he was a shepherd. And so he has sheep and goats, appropriate clean animals available for sacrifice. But I think the thing we're going to learn about Abraham is that he understands the necessity for a blood sacrifice to deal with our sins. And God wanted people all through the Old Testament era to understand that. And so animal sacrifices are what do you call it? Like an omnipresent thing in the culture of the chosen people. So Avram journeyed going on still toward the south. So he's going down into what Hebrews, Israelis call the Negev, the southern desert, probably south of Jerusalem, down around maybe Beersheba, down around Hebron, places like that, if you're looking at a map. Now, there was a famine in the land, not at all unusual, especially in the southern territories where it's desert and there's just not much rainfall down there around the Yam HaMelach, the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. Just not much rainfall at all there. In fact, the community at Qumran, which was on the shores of the Dead Sea, depended on the rains from Jerusalem to come down the Kidron Valley and fill their cisterns with water from up north in the mountain country of Jerusalem. So there's a famine in the land down south where Abraham is currently living. And Avram went down to Egypt. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. And Mitzrayim, remember, was one of the descendants of Ham. And, later on, the descendants of that descendant, Mitzrayim, would be the founders of the nation of Egypt. So Egypt took its name, Mitzrayim, from that descendant. So Egypt, I don't really know where that comes from. Well, it's probably from the Greek. Aigupton is the Greek word for that country. But in the Old Testament, it was always known as Mitzrayim, after that descendant of Ham. So he went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So why would he go to Egypt during a time of famine? He's living in the desert of Canaan, but down in Egypt, there's the Nile River, which regularly overflows its banks and provides very fertile growing of crops, to provide food for hungry people where they don't have, what do they call that? They don't have irrigated land. Later on in Genesis, during the time when Joseph is a prisoner and a slave in Egypt, Joseph's family is going to come down to Egypt to get grain. That's what people did during times of famine. They went to Egypt because the Nile River always provided for the Egyptians. So famine strikes. Avram goes down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance." So if, I got to be careful how I say this. She's a woman of 65 years old, and you wouldn't think of a 65-year-old woman as a fashion model. But Sarah is going to be, I think when she dies, I think she's 127 years old. So at 65, she's in midlife. So the equivalent today would be what? Like a 35 or 40-year-old woman. And you do see some absolutely gorgeous 35 and 40-year-old women. I know I'm sounding like a typical male that, just looks at fleshly things, but that's what we're talking about here. So keep in mind that in this period of history, the length of a person's life is going to depend on the angular velocity of the rotation of the Earth. And it has slowed down from what it was before. People aren't living 800 and 900 years. Now they're living 100, maybe 200 years at the outside. So it's slowed down considerably. But Sarah's going to live to be nearly 130 years old. So she's in midlife and apparently just drop dead gorgeous. And Abraham knows this. And he's going to be going into a territory where he is afraid, or maybe he's knowledgeable of Egyptian culture and Egyptian moral values, and he has some concerns. So he says, "Indeed, I know that you are a beautiful, a woman of beautiful countenance." And I'm sure that made Sarah feel good. What he says after this probably did not make her feel that good. "Therefore, it will happen." It's almost like this is a prophecy. He's predicting. "It will happen when the Egyptians, the Mitzrayim, see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live." Why? Why would they do this? Because she's gorgeous and they want to have physical relations with her. And it's going to turn out that he's right in his prediction. That is what happens. But Abraham is looking at this from his perspective. So he's basically saying to Sarah, if they think I'm your husband, they're going to kill me. And then they're going to have their way with you. But if they think I'm your brother, then they're still going to have their way with you, but they will not believe that they are violating a marriage covenant by having relations with you. And in fact, they may even reward me, like, an Egyptian might come up to Abraham and say, how much do I have to pay you to let me have sex with your sister? So that's what Abraham is expecting is going to happen. That's what does happen. And he thinks his chances of survival and prospering are better off if they think that he is her sister. Now, this may just sound like an outright lie. And in a way, it is, because he's making them believe that there's no marriage covenant between the two of them by telling this story. But technically, she is his sister, as we will learn in a later passage, because this is not the only time Abraham is going to do this. We learn that they are actually brother and sister. They have the same father, but not the same mother, I believe is the way that story goes. So technically they are, I guess you would say, they're step brother and sister. But they are married, and it's a legitimate marriage, and he's going to mislead the Egyptians. So he says to her, verse 13, please say, you are my sister. It's not untrue, but it is covering up the reality. So please say that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you, because you're willing to go along with this what kind of disguise that I'm asking you to put on. Now, it's really easy to sit in our comfy homes and read the Bible and be critical of Abraham for doing this and say, what a coward. And there may be some fear and some cowardice involved, but put yourself in the same position where you feel like you need to go to a foreign country that maybe has completely different morals than you have and maybe hostile to you, but you have to do that to survive. You have to do that to get food. And you just want it to come out as well as it possibly can for you. So a little deception, you feel like maybe the right way. Now, the thing Abraham should have done is stayed in the promised land and trusted God to provide for him. And maybe God would have to do a miracle to provide food and water for Abraham and his family. But he's a God who does miracles. Just let's not be too harsh on Avram for this deception. So it was when Avram came to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, that the Egyptians, the Mitzrayim, saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. Yafa is the Hebrew word for it. I love that. Yafa, she is Yafa. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her. So she is going to be taken into the royal house. She is going to be viewed as a suitable, concubine, I suppose you would say, part of Pharaoh's harem. And one thing we're going to learn about this era of the Bible is that polygamy was rampant. It was everywhere. And it was also very common, maybe the most common thing among the chosen people as well. You know, David has like a dozen wives or so. Solomon has hundreds of wives and concubines and things like that. And God even tells those guys, I gave you these women. Like, why would you want Bathsheba? Look at all the women that I gave you. So it is not God's first best plan for mankind. God's first best plan for mankind is one man, one woman in a lifelong relationship of love and respect and devotion and commitment to each other. But, you know, in the Bible days, there were there were polygamous marriages, and it's sort of like God overlooked them. I think he discouraged them because that's a source of all kinds of problems. But royalty often has harems. So this is the case with Pharaoh. The princes of Pharaoh, the Sarim, the princes of Pharaoh, saw her and commended her. The Hebrew word there is Hallel. They praised her. Like hallelujah is praise to Yahweh. They commended her. There was Hallel LaSarai to Pharaoh. So they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated her well. He treated Abram well for her sake. Now, it appears that Pharaoh's intentions with Sarai were to add her to his harem, but she would probably go through a period, maybe a lengthy period of like preparation. She would be fed a very good diet to make her look as beautiful as, even more beautiful than she was looking in the days of a famine. She would be have makeup and clothing designed for her, so that when she had an intimate relationship with Pharaoh, she would be in like the best possible condition that she could be in, and this might take some time. So it appears to me from the text of Genesis that Pharaoh does not have her way. Pharaoh does not have his way with her, but he intended to. Okay. He treated Avram well for her sake. He had, and I think this is a reference to Abraham. Abraham had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. I think this is the stuff that Pharaoh gave Avram, who he thought was Sarah's brother. It's like this is what he is paying Avram to sleep with his sister. So he doesn't want to steal her from Avram. That would be immoral. He doesn't want to violate the marriage covenant. Even in Pharaoh's eyes, that would be immoral. So he wants to buy her for his harem, which again seems to be an approved practice. It's not the same as prostitution, because he'll take care of her. She will be, she will be his play toy, his plaything, but she will also be part of his household. And his intention is that he'll treat her very well, especially if she pleases him. So Abraham is getting a lot of stuff, and Sarah's in jeopardy. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Avram's wife. It says, like Dave tells us, what kind of plagues is not known. But in a similar situation, and I think this is with Isaac, because like father, like son, Isaac does the same thing that his dad did twice. Isaac does it once, was barrenness. So I think when Isaac does it, God puts a plague on the people who are, wanting to mistreat Rebekah. Everybody in that area, and it's Philistia there, everybody in the territory is sterile. So Isaac prays that God will, release the plague from them. So it may be a plague of barrenness, but it doesn't really say here. So the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Avram's wife. And Pharaoh called to Avram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" Now, how did he know that Sarah was his wife? Maybe Sarah relented and told him. Maybe God appeared to him and told him. Maybe he just figured it out, like this plague would not have occurred unless she was a married woman. Maybe that was, part of his, religion or his moral values or something. But he's come to the conclusion that she's Avram's wife. So verse 19, why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife, take her and go your way. So she was being prepared to either be a sleeping companion of Pharaoh, but what does he say? His intention was that she be his Isha, his wife, his marriage partner. So maybe she was so beautiful, maybe he just fell head over heels in love with her. He wanted her to be more than just a sleeping companion. He wanted to marry her. He wanted her to be his wife. So he says, here's your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning Avram, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So what was the command to his, he commanded concerning Avram, but what did he command? I think it was that they just leave him alone. They've given him all kinds of riches from Egypt, and they've set him free. And Pharaoh is saying, don't go attack that guy. Don't try and kidnap Sarah and rape her or anything like that. Let him go with my blessing. Why did he have that attitude? Because God had plagued him, and he knew he had been struck by God. So you don't want to mess with God's guy. Now, this in a way is kind of a foreshadowing of the Exodus. So the Israelites have been in slavery in Egypt for 4 generations, just living a horrendous lifestyle, being given tasks and work that's just impossible for them to fulfill. And so God calls Moses to go rescue them. But not only does he say, I'll bring them out of Egypt into freedom, but he says they're going to come out of Egypt with an abundance of wealth that the Egyptians will willingly give them just to get rid of them. So this idea of going to Egypt for food, that's why the family of Jacob goes down to Egypt because of famine. They go down there for food, and they come out in the Exodus with all kinds of wealth, silver and gold and precious stones, and all kinds of provisions and stuff like that. So history is repeating itself. The reason I bring that up is because a lot of times in our Western culture, we have an idea that prophecy is like a promise or a prediction made on the timeline, and then a certain number of units of time later, that promise comes true. So there's prediction and fulfillment. But a lot of times, prophecy is not so much, we call that linear fulfillment of prophecy. But sometimes Bible prophecy is not fulfilled in a linear way, but in a cyclical way, in a pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again. And sometimes those repeated patterns are in a way symbolic or figurative or typological of Yeshua, of the Messiah, and our relationship with him. So for example, Abraham goes down to Egypt in a famine, in desperation, starving to death. He and Sarah go down there. And bad things happen to them in Egypt. But they come out in freedom because the Pharaoh of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, sends them out just overflowing with blessings, with prosperity. So same thing happens with, Joseph and his family. They go down to Egypt, which is kind of a symbol of sin in the world. They come out by the power of God, just loaded down with riches. So how about you and me? We are in bondage to sin. The Bible tells us all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It tells us that the wages of sin is death unless you get a substitute who's willing to pay the price for you. Jesus is that substitute. We learn that, our salvation is by God's grace through faith in Yeshua. So we're conceived and born in sin, like born in Egypt. Bad things happen to us in our lives because of our sin, but God loves us. He extends his gospel grace to us. And if we believe him, we get born again, and we come out of the Egypt of sin into the promised land of a relationship with God. But we don't come out empty-handed. We come out with tons of blessings. Some of the blessings that God gives us is the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness. Which ones am I leaving out? Self-control is the last one. We come out with spiritual gifts, supernatural manifestations of the Holy Spirit. We come out with a method of gaining riches from God through tithing and offerings and, faithfulness in our financial riches. So this pattern of salvation, it's already started in the story of Avram. It'll be repeated in the story of the Exodus generation. It's repeated in the days of Genesis. It's repeated in the days of the early church, and it's repeated in our lives to this very day. Prophetic pattern repeated over and over again. So we've come to the end of chapter 12, still in fairly good time. We're about 6 minutes over. So let me give you we'll give me the Old Testament from blessing from Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. See you next time for chapter 13.